I'm Sven Hort, the host of today's talk. As you know, nowadays many people are interested in the welfare and human rights with an aging society and rapidly changing economy, which means we should be aware of knowledge about social welfare. Today's speaker, Dr. Sven Hort, a professor in the Department of Social Welfare at Seoul National University, is going to talk about Korea and Sweden with worldwide perspectives in terms of social rights and human rights. Before we start the talk, please turn off your cell phones or switch them to silent mode. Are you all done?
Yes.
Okay, then please welcome Dr. Hort with a big round of applause.
Thank you, everybody. Actually, do you hear me? This
Yeah.
way?
Yeah.
It's okay?
Yeah.
Well, then I don't need the microphone. But please tell me if I'm... Please tell me if I am not speaking up the way I'm supposed to do, so you can follow my presentation. My name is Sven Hort, and that is Sven is a very typical Scandinavian name. You even find it in Germany and the Netherlands, if there is anyone from the Netherlands here, or from Germany. When I started class at Seoul National University this semester, I found out that I had 3 Dutch students, exchange students from the Netherlands. Germany is, of course, much bigger country in Europe, so I'm more used to see Germans here in Korea, but nevertheless, most times I see Koreans, because this is Korea I'm working in, and I have been doing so for about 3-4 years by now. I have been here for a while. I haven't written anything yet explicitly, exclusively on the Korean welfare system or social rights in Korea, but I have, of course, tried to do research, in particular through working with my students at the university. But I have also tried to approach audiences like this one, talk to people about how it actually works in their specific case. Because having done research about these issues for, let me say, 35 or something like that years now, we started in the late 1970s in Stockholm, Sweden, the capital of Sweden, doing research on, not in a global perspective, but at least in a north hemispheric perspective. We selected my professor at that time. I have started to work with him previously on more specific issues related to labor rights and trade unions, developments and so on and so forth. Maybe I should say that I'm a social scientist and I have my PhD in sociology, but I have also been a professor in Scandinavia, in Norway, in political science. So I've done quite a lot of comparative research, and my professor started out with 18 countries. So we were a team, a group that worked on social rights and social developments at that time in the 20th century, from roughly 1930 onwards, in 18 countries. And there were, I think, something like 9 or 10, 11 maybe European countries. There were the North American countries of Canada and the United States. also Australia and New Zealand was included, and then there was Japan. So Japan was part of this broader picture. So but we never went into what we today call the global south. So that is the limitations when I go into this subject. And now I'll see if I can manage this correctly. Where do I do something like this? Where do I? Here?
Could you press the button toward me?
Towards you?
Yeah.
Nothing happens. What's on? There we go. No, something happened. This one. This one.
It works.
It works. There we go. No, this was not the first one. I came to Guangzhou 4 months ago, first time. I've been in Korea for, I said, 3 or 4 years. So I came here first time. It was a real big experience for me, I must say, from the start, because it was a world forum for human rights, and I have had students at the university here in Korea who are really into world human rights, so I thought I was really familiar with the subject. But what I wasn't really familiar with was the Korean experience of it. So to me, it was enlightening to come here and be part of this event. And I learned a lot here. So I just say that it really strengthened my perception that social rights are part of human rights. And you can say from what I've learned from my first experience in this field was that this is about the right to a life in decency and dignity. And that differs, of course, around the globe, what's considered indecency and dignity. But there are some common denominators, I would say, and some common ways of approaching this subject across the world. And of course, the chronological development differs fairly much. I would say that in many respects social rights often predates what we today perceive as human rights, because of course there were discussions about human rights far back in history, but its official codification you have from the UN Declaration in 1948 after the Second World War. And there were, of course, many attempts, I'm sure, before. But I contrast this with the developments where I started out doing research in my native country of Sweden, though I say that I'm as much a Dane as a Swede. Because from Denmark, Sweden imported, you can say, much of it. And Denmark, in turn, had learned lots from its southern neighbor of Germany. And as I'm born almost on the border of Sweden and Denmark, I don't feel this very strong attachment to the nation state necessarily, but have more of a Scandinavian, I would say, approach to this matter. So in Sweden there was the 1913 pension law that stated that an old age benefit to all and everybody was a social right. And that was something that was important. It is often in the international history of pensions and retirement considered the first universal pension law in the world. But if you look closely into the developments in Denmark, you'll find that about the decade before, the Danish parliament approved a similar setup based on their local communities, their municipalities, their local authorities. So exactly how we should make this into history is still a kind of It's not really clear cut. The important with this kind of law, when we look at it, is, I would say, stress that it was a compulsory savings scheme. It was not the benefit that was the important thing at the start. It was the savings, the money you put into the system, because the whole idea was to create a fund for the future, for the future of these people who lived at this time to have a life in decency and dignity. So it had a long-term perspective. It was a savings scheme. There was a benefit paid out almost from the start, actually, from 1914, to those who were above the age of 67 at this time. And you should know that the average age of Swedes at this time, how long they lived, was below, I think it was 55 or something like that. So, I mean, it was not a particularly costly system. But it was a compulsory saving system, and everybody had to save. Those who had nothing to save, the law proclaimed that the local community should contribute through their local authority, should contribute to the national fund. So poor people, without any means of monetary terms, they were also savers, but they did it through the joint efforts of the community they lived in. So it meant that being a resident was very important of a certain area. But nevertheless, I mean, everybody has the right to the benefit at the end of the day. Now I see it works. So often, when you look at this from an international perspective, the order of rights are often covered in terms of civil, political and social rights. Social rights comes at the end of the day, you can say. It starts out with the change from being subjects of the king or the queen into citizens of the republic. To be a modern member of society means to be a member of a republic. But you should know that in Scandinavia, the head of the republic is still the king or the queen. In Denmark, in Norway, in Sweden. So you can say that these societies I'm coming from, they are not fully modern yet. Although many people think that they are extremely modern. Yesterday, I learned, when I came here, I met a friend, I think, in the audience, but I cannot see him at the moment. He had to go. He had to do something else. But he learned that he had been to Stockholm for 3 days, and he had met a Korean who had lived there for 3 or 5 years or something like that. Quite a long time. And she had told him that to live in Korea, that was to live in an exciting hell. But in Scandinavia was to live in a boring heaven. So the idea of this fulfillment of development is attached to this area, but I would say it still has a long way to go. It's not at the end of the road, I would say. But in terms of citizenship, you can say that the triple nature of citizenship, civil rights, have been achieved with there is an equality before the law, there are property rights, there are freedoms of expression, there are no, you can say, very little impediments to civil rights. Political rights are also basically achieved, you can say, for most people. Even for people who have come to the area recently, they can vote in local elections, and I think after a few years they are also able to apply for citizenships. I don't know if it's 3 years or 5 years, but it's a very short period nowadays. So and then there is these social rights that creates a huge what we call a welfare system of labor and livelihood rights from the start of life to the end of life. And I think it's very important in a country like Korea to stress that this is about the start of life. Very much about the start of life. Not about that there is an elderly population, growing elderly population. It's in particular important to emphasize that this is a country where lots of newborns are coming to the world. Lots of people are born in this part of the world. So the population almost reproduces itself through various means of survival, you can say. Now let's see here. Yeah. In contrast, I give I'm sure you are at the forum of human rights. You're all familiar with the developments. I'm not an expert in this field, but I just want to contrast it with the typical way of looking at social rights. I mean, here we have this strong declaration from 1948 that was almost, I mean, not really in existence until the mid-1970s, because it was only when Amnesty International and some other organizations like that started to really watch the rights all over the world that it got off the ground. It was the period of the Cold War and nation states and divisions of the world. So in many respects, I would say that it was a kind of contest still between warfare and welfare. I mean, here in Korea you had it early on with the war, and it continued various places in the world, this kind of conflicts where human rights were not at all on the agenda until after, you can say, the idea of basically the Asian Wars came to an end. We still have an absence in many respects of the international law, also after 1991. I mean, it's still not, it is very much the survival of the fittest, a warfare that has continued, though we thought that maybe the end of the Cold War meant that of course in Korea you had a different situation with a division between North and South. But in many parts of the world it was considered the end of history in many respects. I think the idea of human rights must be contextualized into, it's not just that we are one human global community, one race, because we have also racial divides. We have regional divides around the world still, and we have religious divides. The world is divided according to these three R's. So the idea of creating human communities, imagined communities, and what I call common pool resource institutions is still very much on the agenda and has not has a long way to go. Now I'm trying to I use these words, imagined communities and common pool resource institutions, because it's not always clear what is the imagined community. It's so clear to me when I'm here in Korea that what is Korea? Is it the North and the South together, or is it South and North? And there are lots of Koreans living in the borders along the Chinese border up in the north and so on and so forth. So coming from a world where the Kingdom of Sweden was once had an eastern half, Finland today, an independent country which is nowadays considered themselves as a national unit, but for a long, long time this was considered the eastern part of Sweden. And even at the time when Sweden had a monarchical union, which was ended just in 1905. For 100 years, roughly, Sweden had a monarchical union with Norway, which was peacefully dissolved. It was probably one of the first examples where you can see these secessions of two nations, but nevertheless we speak the same language, basically, and have very much in common, extremely much, I would say. And then there is Denmark, in this area. So what I would like to stress that during the 19th century, this was a very poor area, but there were no war up there. There were no war. And that is a major experience for generations to be out of war, to have lived under peaceful conditions. The exception is, and this you can say lasted into the 20th century, though both Denmark and Norway were occupied by the German Reich, by Hitler. So, nevertheless, they so to say survived, but on the other hand, Norway developed also as a new imagined community, a new nation state, and today is the most prosperous area in Scandinavia, in the north. But there was, through the popular social movements during the 19th century, an enormously active mobilization of the common people to take command over their resources in society, to formulate it in the end into social rights, to take control over their lives, but also to formulate it as obligations towards each other. This is the idea of common pool resource organizations, or common pool resource institutions. The idea that you can have joint pools, that you control yourself, that you are part of the, so to say, the imagined community, and control what's the resources there. So what I will stress a right that is not at all inscribed in this global human rights, not at all inscribed, and it's very foreign also to a Korean audience, I have found, the right to be a taxpayer, the right to pay taxes. Because if you don't have any resources, you cannot have a common pool resource institution. Taxes to pool resources together is the most common way to get this going, to get these institutions going. But here I think what I've experienced so much in Korea is this idea that we can have welfare but without taxes. And it seems to me, it's so completely foreign to me, coming from an area where there is a high tax society. So in that sense, I think again it's important to stress this phenomenon that social rights came in many respects before or together with political rights. They were not separate as a kind of end product. So you have to take into account both taxes and social benefits, and the idea that you control the state yourself, or your, so to say, unity, your institution. So there is a very strong historical narrative in this Scandinavia of this route, this development from farmers to workers, from nation state to welfare state. That this is a joint project. And it's also, you can say, the control of civil society through class compromises. The control of the society you live in, not through devastating, more or less military conflicts, but through the possibility to reach compromises, enlightened, peaceful means of, and in particular between employers and employees. So despite that, in particular Sweden, have had a long history of what you call Sjöbols, you are with me? Big companies? Sjöbols, yeah? Sjöbols, yeah?
Car company.
Huh?
Car company.
Yeah, big companies, huge companies. There's a long history, but nevertheless they have adapted to the situation where there are huge organizations of the common people. So there is more of a, so to say, possibility to come together over the negotiation table. And this is what we could call equality in freedom, in liberty. The combination of equality and liberty. Liberty and equality going together, and thereby raise the possibility of creating local communities, working local communities that are independent of the big companies. Of course, they are dependent in the sense that these companies must sell and produce, but nevertheless, they have a say over the life after the working day. You can control your working time in particular. I think this is a big issue in Korea still. How you seem to work, or at least be on the workplace for such a long time of the working day. And that is, I would say, one of the impediments to developing a kind of working family life. The possibility to have children and to make possible a reasonable everyday life between old and young. I'm realizing that I'm almost going out of now. You can say that there is a kind of divide in Scandinavia before and after 1889-91, because there was a big change with the developments in with the end to the Cold War. Scandinavia became much more integrated, also politically and even, you can say, military, into the European community. Because previously there was a rather vague or Nordic community because of the fragile East-West balance. There was an attempt to create an economic union in Scandinavia in 1971, but in the end most states except Norway became members of the European Union in 1995. At the time when the Atlantic community, you can say, in particularly the United States, became the most powerful and expansive organization in the area. So and this has been also a period of economic crisis, not so much in Scandinavia in recent time. The crisis came with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because in particular Finland, the neighbor of the Soviet Union, was particularly hit by the disappearance of the Soviet economy. So there are, of course, relationships to the world that has created lots of uncertainty, and that has continued, in particular into the latest crisis of the 2008 and so on and so forth, when it has been very hard on and off to uphold the social rights and the social standards of these countries, with the exception of Norway, you can say. I mean, from an outsider perspective, I talked about Korea a lot when I've been here. I mean, you can say that to me, looking historically at Korea, it seems to be so much into this division and being into a small country, part of the bigger powers here, Japan and China, and the war, of course, the absence of human social rights. But they have developed, I would say, over the years. They are very, in Korea, I have seen from doing so far not unfinished research, but I would say that you have seen the development of many welfare institutions in Korea over the last 25 or 30 years, like pension laws and health insurance and such things, but it's still very unclear really where the developments are heading, I would say. The differences between the two, between Scandinavia and Korea, are still very very, they are large. You can talk perhaps about even divergent paths, that they are going in opposite directions. Korea, in many respects, perhaps still following the only welfare state that we were investigating in Scandinavia in the 1980s, Japan, though Koreans don't like to say that Korea is following Japan. But I think there are some similarities still. Whenever I go to a meeting in Korea about welfare state developments, there is always a Japanese there talking about Japanese developments. So I think there is a lot of communications, so to say, underneath the official high level. And of course, the developments in China is very important for the future, what will go on there. But in that sense, I'm quite of an optimist, because I think the Chinese developments in the last 10 or 15 years points towards an interest into the how to keep a nation, a huge emerging community together. And you have to have some kind of acceptable social standards also in such a huge country as China. And they are taking steps, they're trying to develop pension laws and such things, but they have, of course, because of fairly recent historical developments, a huge problem with family laws and family population. The idea of the one-child policy in China has not really been conducive to development of improving, you can say, services for families and joint efforts to create a favorable development for all children. So again, I think the major challenge in this part of the world is the absence of children. I mean, on the one hand, there is it's so many people living here. So, I mean, it's not really the agenda of the day, but nevertheless, for the future, it's important that the fertility rate increase, I think. So I think there is a common future in that sense, that all over the world, before we, so to say, through the idea of one race and one humanity and human rights for all and everybody on an equal ground, I think there is a strong, there is a need for strong efforts to develop social rights all over the world as a kind of foundation for an everyday life in decency and dignity. So with this word, I think I stop. I don't think I talk about Korea's need of 5 revolutions. Not only the revolutions you have had, but I think also there is a need for an institutional revolution in this country, in the sense that you need to get local authorities with strength and possibilities to develop social services and social institutions for, in particular, families and the elderly, of course, where the poverty problem seems to be quite severe, to say the least. So with these words, I just end I say there is a necessity for another revolution in Korea. You have had so many, but I think you need one more. But maybe it could be a peaceful revolution, in the sense that I think there is a great need to develop the local institutions in this country to go ahead, to develop, because it's such an exciting country. Maybe it's not a hell, as this Korean woman living in Stockholm said, but I think it's such it's a country with so many possibilities, and that's why I think it's so great to be here. Thank you very much.